My husband took revenge for my cheating and laughed while waving a prenup at me. Alex, who is 36 years old and male, was my college sweetheart. He had dreamy eyes and a strong physique, and he used to playfully carry me around to tease me. We tied the knot in a charming church ceremony and spent 10 wonderful years together. Our relationship was the talk of the town, and our friends envied us as a 36-year-old. Alex was my rock. I loved him with all my heart and dreamed of a future where we'd grow old together. He proved to be an amazing husband. He was always dedicated to our marriage and family. He was loyal, faithful, and reliable. He made my needs and happiness a priority. He treated me with respect, kindness, and empathy, making sure I always felt loved and valued. He was always there for me, listening to my concerns and offering his help when I needed it. He was my rock. He supported my goals and dreams, offering guidance and help whenever I needed it. He was patient and understanding, trying to see things from my perspective. Honesty was his policy, and he maintained open and transparent communication. He didn't keep secrets or withhold important information from me, and he valued candid discussions. I took great pride in my choice of husband, appreciating his steadfastness. However, I did wish he was a little more exciting in the bedroom. One day, I crossed paths with a guy named Ethan, a 22-year-old. A year ago, I met Ethan at a business conference. We hit it off straight away, and I found myself really drawn to his charisma and charm. We exchanged numbers and started having regular phone conversations and text exchanges. I knew it was wrong to engage with another man in this way, but I couldn't resist. Things between Ethan and me quickly escalated. We began meeting in secret, and before I knew it, I was involved in an affair with Ethan, and I felt guilty whenever I saw him. He was very attractive and made me feel alive again. I hadn't felt this way with Alex in a long time. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. I was caught up in a web of lies and deceit. I loved Alex very much, but I also had strong feelings for Ethan. Eventually, Alex found out about my affair with Ethan, and it really hurt him. He couldn't understand why I would do such a thing. I tried to explain that I was unhappy in our marriage and that Ethan made me feel alive again, but Alex was too upset to listen. He only saw the emotional side of our affair. He knew about the physical aspect. I dread to think how he would have reacted. Alex asked me to end the affair and work on our marriage, but I was torn between my love for him and my feelings for Ethan. I didn't tell him this, but I didn't want to cause harm. I found myself at a crossroads. Then one day while I was out walking, I came across an tent. I saw an elderly couple holding hands, and it made me realize how lucky I was. I didn't want to lose what I had with Alex, so I asked him to meet up. We had a long chat about our marriage. I was brave enough to tell Alex how I was feeling. I told him I felt neglected and unhappy, and he listened carefully. He said he loved me and wanted to work on our relationship, but he made it clear that I needed to end things with Ethan. It was a tough decision, but I knew it was the right one. I called Ethan and told him it was over. He was really upset, but he understood why I'd made that choice. I knew I'd hurt both men, but I was committed to making things better. I hurt both men, but I was determined to fix my marriage. Alex and I worked on our relationship. We got counseling to improve our communication and rediscovered our romance by going on dates and doing things we enjoyed together when our relationship first started. I realized that I had taken Alex for granted and that he was the man I truly loved. I took Alex for granted and didn't appreciate him as much as I should have done. He forgave me for my affair, and we decided to move on from the past. We grew closer than ever, which made me realize that choosing Alex over Ethan was the right thing to do. I learned that the grass isn't always greener on the other side, and that sometimes what we seek is right in front of us. Alex and I reached new heights in our relationship. I was used to getting beautiful bouquets of roses at work and home, plus sweet cards from him, all showing how much he loved me. I thought Ethan was perfect, so why did I still want him around? I was told not to think about him, let alone try to contact him. I was strong-willed, but my physical desires were weak. Despite my better judgment, I reached out to Ethan and told him I loved him. I suggested we rekindle our secret affair, and he admitted he missed me too. Our affair reignited with more passion than ever. Alex was completely unaware of what was going on. I made sure to cover my tracks both in the real world and online. His week-long trip to another state was approaching, and I was excited to share the news with Ethan. I told Ethan the news, and I was really looking forward to having some time to myself at my place. When the day arrived, Alex was a bit emotional and said he'd miss me. I shed a few tears too, but deep inside I felt a sense of freedom in being alone less than half an hour after his departure. Ethan arrived at our house looking really happy. He didn't say anything, but he took me up to our bedroom and started searching. Meanwhile, I heard some noise downstairs but didn't pay it any mind. I was fully absorbed in my intense encounter with Ethan. However, not even 2 minutes later, Alex stood in the doorway of our bedroom, utterly shocked to find me in our marital bed with another man. He said, "How could you? I trusted you, forgave you, and gave you everything. Absolutely everything." That's what Alex. He shouted as he stormed down the stairs, leaving me speechless. I hastily wrapped myself in a sheet and rushed downstairs to explain that things weren't what they seemed, but I couldn't catch up to him. An hour later, he sent a text instructing me to leave his house. I immediately escorted Ethan out and began packing my belongings while trying to figure out where to go. Ultimately, I decided to go back to my mother's house. I tried to get hold of Alex by text and phone, but he didn't reply. A week later, I got divorce papers at my mother's house. He didn't have a conversation with me, offer therapy, or try to sort out our issues. Instead, he quickly got a divorce, which made me wonder how much I mattered to him. My mother had insisted on a prenuptial agreement, so assets and income acquired during our marriage were held under each other's names. This meant Alex received 80% of our properties, given his significantly higher income. I was left with nearly nothing to my name and no place to call home. I couldn't even claim child support because despite our numerous efforts, we hadn't. It was a tough time. I found it really difficult to cope with everything that was going on. It felt like life was just plain unfair. But that's another story. Let's move on to something more upbeat. Stay tuned, and I'll tell you more. My wife is 45 and I'm 51. We've been married for 25 years and we live in the Midwest. We're farmers. We have 2 children, an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old. My daughter, who recently started college, and my son, who sadly passed away 5 years ago. He would have turned 20 if he were still with us. I met my wife when I started working for her grandparents, who were farmers like us. My wife's parents separated when she was young, so she was happier living with her grandparents. When she turned 18, she made the choice to FORP. She moved in with her grandparents and started helping out on the farm. What makes my wife special is that she's not your typical woman. She's got beauty with her long blonde hair, and she takes care of herself. She's not afraid of getting her hands dirty, and she takes great care of our animals. She knows a lot about farm tools and machinery. When I first met her 3 decades ago, I was immediately drawn to her, not just because of her looks, but also her capabilities. It was a rare experience for me to meet a small-town girl who was tough and attractive at the same time. She really enjoyed having fun with the guys who worked for her grandparents on the farm, and everyone liked her. I was just a country boy who grew up around farms and didn't know much else. My parents were farmers too, but they weren't as successful as my wife's grandparents, who were on a profiting. When my wife turned 19, we started dating. We had a great working relationship, and it seemed like marriage was just a matter of time. Things were going well, especially because our son had a natural talent for farming. He showed a lot of promise and often took the initiative to handle tasks on the farm without needing guidance. Then one day while driving his truck on I-94, tragedy struck. He was involved in a fatal accident. Wheeler lost control of the truck and crashed. He didn't survive the accident and passed away instantly. It was a really sad time for us. My wife, in particular, struggled with the pain of our son's absence after the funeral. She went through a lot, and it was like she changed completely. She went through a lot of changes. She was no longer as active or involved on the farm. She spent a lot of time in bed. She also developed an anxiety disorder that made her overly attached, both physically and emotionally. Her level of attachment grew to an intense degree, surpassing what it used to be. I found it really difficult to leave for work in the mornings or to attend to our daughter. She was so negative, and it was a big change from her usual self. She was also really clingy at night, and it was hard to find personal space in bed. She wanted to cuddle throughout the night, but she was so tight that it made it difficult to breathe. It felt like being in a tight hold, like you'd experience with a Muay Thai fighter. Even when I thought she was asleep, she continued to cling tightly. She seemed to require kisses every hour or two, which was completely unlike her before our son's accident. Our bed life changed a lot too. Before we were moderately active, we were intimate around 2 or 3 times a week. After our son passed away, that frequency increased to almost twice a day, even when I didn't feel like it. This was while we were still mourning his loss. I realized that this starred, she needed to be close to me a lot more than usual. I'd never seen her like this before. Sometimes I don't feel like doing what she wants, but she doesn't listen to me. It's like she wants it so much that I don't want to upset her by saying no. It's as if we only do things that interest her, and I don't get a chance to voice my preferences or desires. It's like the focus is so on what pleases her that our intimate moments are becoming more about satisfying her needs and desires. I began to wonder if this act is turning into something I need to do for her to find happiness, as a way for her to cope. Rather than an activity we do together out of love for each other, she gets upset over even the smallest things, which causes arguments from time to time. When she's in a bad mood, she talks a lot about the farm and sometimes gets frustrated with our workers. During that period, there was a 14-year-old. We had an old boy who used to come to the farm to help us out. His parents had problems with misuse and pills since he was frequently around. I suggested to my wife that we adopt him, given his tough situation with neglectful parents. However, she strongly opposed the idea. The young boy continued coming. The boy started coming to the farm to help us. My wife started to like him and said he reminded her of our son, which made me a bit worried at first, but I didn't think much about it. About a year later, my wife's condition improved a lot, and I think a big part of that was because the boy was now 15. The boy was around 15 years old. The boy and my wife got close, but I wasn't worried because I knew he was a good, responsible young man. My wife suggested we adopt him so he could spend more time with us, even though he was already around a lot. Once the adoption was complete, things improved. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at home. My wife's mood improved significantly. I started to observe that my wife and our adopted son were growing extremely close. They would engage in late-night conversations after I'd gone to bed. She often stayed up much later than her usual bedtime. I, on the other hand, tended to go to bed early because my days began before sunrise. My mornings started with a trip to the barn to attend to the cattle. I made sure the cattle had enough food and fresh water because their health was a top priority. I also checked them for any signs of illness or injury and gave them any necessary medication. Once I finished looking after the cattle, I moved on to the fields where we grew corn during planting season. I could be quite busy preparing the soil and planting corn seeds. My adopted son and I often helped out with this when it was corn planting season. My job was to keep an eye on the corn plants and make sure they got enough water and nutrients. Sometimes I had to use irrigation to keep them hydrated and apply fertilizers to nourish them. I also kept a close eye out for any pests or diseases that could harm the corn. Depending on the time of year, I might have various tasks to handle. For instance, during harvest time, my adopted son and I, along with some hired hands who were usually close friends of mine, had to oversee the process of gathering the corn using specialized machinery like combine harvesters to efficiently collect the ripe corn. After collecting the corn, my responsibility extended to ensuring it was my job to make sure it was stored properly and transported to different places as needed, like for animal feed or sale. At first, I wasn't worried about the close relationship between my wife and adopted son, especially since my daughter also spent time with them. 2 years after our son's tragic passing, life seemed to be slowly returning to normal, despite the loss. But my son's memory was still alive in my heart. My wife and I were getting used to the new normal. She was coping in a way that seemed a bit strange to me. She developed a strong bond with our adopted son. They'd often share hugs and watch TV together under a blanket. Over time, this became a common sight. It didn't strike me as unusual. Our intimate life underwent significant changes. It dwindled to about once every 2 weeks. I didn't think much of it at the time. After a long day at work, I often felt too old for frequent bedroom activities. I lacked the energy for it. My adopted son and I dedicated a substantial part of our days to attending to the cattle and managing the cornfields. However, there were also administrative tasks handled by my wife and daughter. These included keeping track of expenses and maintaining records for both the cattle and the corn. And there was all that paperwork to deal with too, like regulations and sales. One day, I got suspicious about my wife and our adopted son. I couldn't find him, so I started looking for him. We had a separate barn where my wife spent most of her time. I went to the office door, thinking he might be in there. I thought my adopted son might be inside, just outside the door. His dirty shoes seemed to indicate that he was likely indoors. The office door had a faulty locking mechanism, so I couldn't lock it from the inside. When I opened the office door, it seemed like I'd walked in on something involving my wife and our adopted son. There was a brief moment when their expressions conveyed that they were. I was caught off guard, but at that time I didn't think what I saw was anything more than a fleeting moment. Fast forward 3 years, and our daughter turned 18, heading off to college. This meant that at home it was just me, our adopted son, and my wife. During the harvest season, we had additional hands helping on the farm after a long day's work. It was customary for us to visit a bar for some drinks. However, since my adopted son was not yet 19 and below the legal drinking age, he would typically head inside the house early as the day was coming to an end. I told the other workers to go on without me, explaining that I needed to complete a few remaining tasks. After finishing these, I went to check on the cattle to make sure they were settled for the night. It was time to make sure that all our equipment was stored correctly for the evening. I felt like I had to go to the office and tell my wife that I was leaving. That was pretty out of character for me, since it had become our routine to go out after a busy day of harvesting. As I turned the doorknob and opened the door, I already felt uneasy. As I sat down, I had a strange feeling that something was wrong. When the door opened, I was overwhelmed by a sudden surge of emotions. It was as though time had slowed down, giving me the opportunity to observe every aspect of the scene that was unfolding in front of me. There, in the midst of it all, was my wife, the person I had always held in the highest regard, on her knees. My heart was racing as I performed a blowjob on our adopted son. I was shocked and disbelieving. My mind struggled to comprehend what I was witnessing. I was suddenly overwhelmed by a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. These emotions swirled together, leaving me feeling almost numb. I couldn't control myself. My hands clenched into fists, and I took deep breaths. I took a few deep breaths. It was as if a surge of energy coursed through me, making me feel somewhat dizzy for a moment. It felt like I was suspended in time, disconnected from my surroundings. The room seemed hazy at the edges. My focus narrowed to the distressing scene before me. I had an initial urge to shout and demand an explanation. I wanted to release the turmoil inside me. Yet there was another part of me that wanted to avert my gaze. I wanted to deny what I was seeing and cling to the hope that it wasn't real as time passed. It became clear that I couldn't avoid facing the situation. Understanding washed over me, snapping me out of my initial shock and propelling me into a more determined frame of mind. Tears welled up in my eyes, a mixture of sadness and frustration. My voice trembled. As I found the courage to speak, I asked my question in a way that showed I was open and vulnerable, which I hadn't been in a long time. "What's going on?" My adopted son couldn't look me in the eye. I could see guilt and surprise on his face. My wife turned her attention to me. Her eyes showed shame, regret, and an unusual hint of defiance. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the irregular rhythm of my breath. In that moment, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Everything had changed. The solid foundation of trust upon which our relationship rested had crumbled, and there was no way to undo it. Betrayal seemed to emanate from both my wife and my adopted son. I was angry as I grabbed him by the neck and forcibly removed him from the room. My wife was screaming, trying to intervene. My rage was so intense. I had this overwhelming urge to hurt him, but I managed to restrain myself. I told him firmly that if he ever set foot in our house again, there would be consequences. I turned away and left behind a whirlwind of intense pain and confusion. In the midst of this overwhelming emotional turmoil, I went to the bar to be in the company of my friends, hoping to temporarily forget the shocking scene I had just witnessed. I was so overwhelmed by what I had seen that I didn't want to be alone, even though I knew I shouldn't dwell on it. It felt like the situation was too much to handle, and my emotions were all over the place. At the bar, I tried to ignore my thoughts, but they kept coming back. It all felt too big. My mind kept going back to one question: how long? This had been going on for a while. We adopted him at 14, and he was nearly 19 when I found out the truth, but I couldn't work out how long it had been going on for. The noise in my head got louder and louder, so I decided to head home early. I needed to talk to my wife and face up to what was going on. When I got home, my wife wasn't there. My adopted son had packed his belongings and left too. I was hit by the full weight of the situation and couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I called my daughter to describe what was going on. I told her about the scene I'd seen involving her mom. She wasn't surprised. She'd already thought something was going on between them, even though she hadn't seen anything. My daughter was ready to confront the situation, but my wife was too scared to go back. She ignored all attempts at communication for several months. When my daughter reached out, she didn't reply. My wife's first reaction was to say it was a mistake. She later admitted that her feelings had changed and that she had developed romantic feelings for our adopted son. She was worried about how I would react. My daughter told me that both my wife and our adopted son were staying at a hotel, which made me even more confused and disoriented. Despite my efforts to the contrary, I felt like I was losing control. I had dedicated my life to managing and operating the farm I legally owned. Nothing, because my wife had inherited it from her grandparents. I felt betrayed, lost, and uncertain. I examined our business accounts and discovered that a significant amount of money had been recently withdrawn in response. I withdrew the remaining funds and opened a new business account to prevent her from accessing it. I was really torn. I'd always planned to retire on the farm, but now I was facing a dilemma. If I filed for divorce, I'd lose everything I'd invested in, despite having enough saved to support myself until I was 80. I still loved my work, though. I decided to speak to a divorce lawyer to get advice on how to proceed with the marriage. The lawyer advised me to stay married because I could lose a lot of money if I left. I was worried about making our situation public because we don't have many family connections and it could affect our community. My daughter was there for me, giving me lots of support. She was a great help. Then out of the blue, my wife, after about 2 months, she called to say she wanted to come back home and apologize for her betrayal. She also mentioned that she was going to therapy to try to save our marriage. I have to admit, I had some pretty mixed feelings. I was really tempted to divorce her straight away, but I knew that would be a huge mistake. When I saw her in that situation, I felt all the love and regret. I felt like I disappeared from her life. My heart seemed to darken, and I even entertained disturbing thoughts. I even considered harming her to gain control of everything. The idea of having her back was almost unbearable, but I kept thinking of my late son. I decided to give her another chance, but things have changed significantly since I caught her. I've devised a plan to acquire her. I've bought my own piece of land and started my own cattle herd since my son passed away. My wife's attention has shifted away from the business, so I've taken on the role of driving its operations. I understand the logistics, maintain customer relationships, and manage the supply chain, while she has played a part. I've essentially been accumulating wealth for her, but now my focus is turning towards my own well-being. I'm currently working on launching my own business over the next couple of years. My goal is to create something free from her influence. Ultimately, I'm preparing myself for the possibility of divorce by that time. If she is still alive, this decision revolves around my own future and finding a way to move forward independently. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you believe this gentleman? Should he give up his dignity to keep his farm, or should he think about getting a divorce, which could mean losing everything? My life is in a mess, and I don't know who to turn to for help, except you, people on the internet. Let me give you some background. Just over a month ago, my husband Troy, who is 31, decided to have a wine and dine event with our friends to celebrate our 3rd anniversary. I wasn't completely sold on the idea, but Troy was set on throwing a party to celebrate us. It might sound a bit strange, but at the time, all I could think about was whether his best friend would be there. There was this one night when we were all out together, and Troy kept giving me these suggestive glances while we were dancing at the club. He even signaled for me to join him on the dance floor while Troy was in the phone. I went to the restroom to deal with a stomach ache. I declined his dance invitation, but we'd all had a bit too much to drink, and he seemed attractive with his shirt undone. In that moment, I felt a shift in our relationship. I wasn't sure how I'd feel when I saw him at the party. I hadn't seen him since that night, and a few weeks had passed. I wanted to address the moments that I wanted to talk about, what had happened between us, and move on from it. I think it's helpful to give you some background. Troy's best friend Mitch is 34, and they've been friends for 20 years. I've known Mitch as long as I've known Troy. However, for the first 2 years of my relationship with my husband, Mitch and I were just friends. After we got married, it seemed like Mitch was afraid of losing his bester. Mitch started coming with us on almost all our trips and often brought other women along because he wasn't ready to commit to just one. I was still just his friend, but everything changed after that night at the club. Troy made a heartfelt toast, expressing his love for me and his excitement about having children together. I was overwhelmed. I was so embarrassed that I excused myself to the guest bathroom to compose myself as I was about to leave. Mitch followed me in, and what happened next wasn't something I had planned for. The pleasure was so intense that I couldn't control myself. It was thrilling to know that everyone else was outside while we were engaged in an intimate encounter inside, trying to remain discreet. We carried on for another 15 minutes or so until I heard a knock on the door, followed by Troy calling my name. I felt guilty instantly. I pushed Mitch away and pretended I was fixing my appearance. A couple of minutes later, I left the bathroom with him following me. About 30 minutes after that, we made sure Troy didn't suspect anything. The most troubling aspect of this whole situation is that it wasn't a one-off. A couple of days ago, a week after the party, Mitch came over while Troy was at the gym late. We had an intimate encounter, and it was while we were in the middle of it that I heard Troy entering the room and catching us in the act. My husband had a complete breakdown right in front of us while we were lying in our bed, naked, desperately trying to cover ourselves. It was a horrifying sight, but he quickly regained his composure and became very angry. Troy physically confronted Mitch and forcefully ejected him from the house at 1 a.m. He was completely nude in the freezing -5 weather. Then he turned to me and said I'd be spending the night on the couch. He gathered my belongings on the spot and tossed them out into the living room. I didn't have much of a choice and spent a restless 2 days on the couch. Then I received a text from him 48 hours later. Later, I got a link with a PDF of a plane ticket. When I opened it, it showed my details for a flight from New York to Orlando, leaving in a week. I couldn't believe I'd jeopardized a relationship I'd built over 5 years, 3 of them being married, for a mere 5 minutes. I made a mistake. What should I do? I still have a week to try and fix things, as I can't go back to live with my grandparents. I can't tell anyone about this, which is why I'm seeking your advice. Please help me out. Update. I've tried to talk to him, but he's isolating himself in the room. He's not going to work. I've been emerging to have meals. It's been 36 hours since I received the plane ticket, and during this time, I haven't had a meal or slept. I haven't even changed my clothes because I don't want to create a mess in the living room. I'm feeling helpless. I knocked on his door throughout the night, but he didn't respond. All I could hear was the TV. After playing inside for a while, he finally came out and stood at the doorway of the living room. I asked if he'd eaten anything and mentioned that I'd prepared 2 sandwiches for him. He seemed disgusted by them and went back to his room without saying anything. I saw my flight scheduled on the coffee table. There were bags on the table with new clothes in them and an envelope. I opened one of the bags and found the rest of my stuff. I was really upset because I had a whole miniature collection of things with me, and he hadn't said anything to me. I've been cooking for both of us when I get home, but I end up eating alone. I often wake up to the sound of him coming home, only to see him head straight to his room. We haven't had any conversations at all. It's astonishing how everything is unraveling so abruptly. I just wish I could understand what's going on in his mind. I really hope he isn't thinking about getting a divorce. It would be a huge shock to me, and I don't think I'd ever recover. It's been a few months now since I've had to leave our shared home and move in with my grandparents. He still hasn't spoken to me. I've sent him over 500 texts, but I'm really worried about him. He's blocked me on all platforms. However, a friend he still follows on Instagram mentioned that he posted stories of himself hiking with his work friends, which eases my worries about his safety today. I received a large envelope, and upon opening it, I discovered the divorce papers I had been dreading, along with a letter. I haven't read the letter yet, nor have I signed the divorce papers. Edit. I've read the letter, and it was heart-wrenching. It was really tough to read. He poured out his feelings about the whole situation, saying how much he loves me and our life together. The letter was 3 pages long, but I couldn't bear to read more than the first page. He said he'd be taking time off work to look after himself. He also said I should sign the divorce papers and send them back to our address. But I don't want to do that. I just want him back. I feel terrible for being with someone else other than my husband. It wasn't supposed to happen. I blame myself for this situation. I can't imagine my life without him. It has been 4 days since I received the divorce papers, and I have signed them.